So today we're going to be looking at Zeno, who was born about 490 BC. We don't know exactly when he died, but it was certainly after 450 BC. He comes from Elea in southern Italy, which was then part of the Greek world, and he was the pupil and friend of Parmenides, whose philosophy we've already looked at. He wrote a book when he was only 24 years old of paradoxes, apparently 40 paradoxes. They don't all survive. All we have are some paraphrases of a few of the paradoxes in later writers such as Aristotle. And these paradoxes are apparently in support of the views of his master Parmenides. He attacks the notion that more than one thing can exist. He questions the possibility of motion and hence, of course, of time and space as well. Now, the question for us is, how serious is he being? Is he just joking? Is he being mischievous? He is, after all, only 24 years old. Is he just enjoying stirring up the status quo? What's he really up to? What's the motive behind his work? Now, let's remember what the word paradox means in ancient Greek. We've already looked at this in the videos we made about Heraclitus. So para means against, and doxa means common opinion or belief. So paradox is something that goes against common opinion or belief. Zeno's paradoxes are questioning our beliefs that there are more than one thing in the universe, that we can move, that time and space do exist. These are all things that we believe, and he's saying these beliefs are not founded on logic. What's the motive? We have some clues from Plato and Aristotle. First of all, we've got Plato's dialogue called the Parmenides, in which he recounts a visit to Athens in about 450 BC made by Parmenides, then quite an elderly man for the time of about 65, and his young friend and associate Zeno, who's approaching 40, we're told. And they create a huge stir in Athens, and particularly because this is the first time the Athenians have heard Zeno's book, and Zeno gives these public readings of his 40 paradoxes in support of one thing in existence, or apparently in support of one thing in existence. And at one of these public readings, the very young Socrates was present, possibly only in his late teens or about 20. And the young Socrates is intrigued and fascinated, but also very, very puzzled about what Zeno's real intentions are. Does Zeno really think that we can't move? And Socrates asks Zeno some questions. And according to Plato, in his dialogue, the Parmenides, this is what Zeno replies. Zeno claims that Socrates has not quite understood what he's on about. And he says, Socrates, you're wrong to say I'm just deliberately setting out to deceive people. What I'm really doing is trying to support my master Parmenides. And this is what Plato writes. He says his book is, in truth, he says, it is a sort of defense of Parmenides' arguments against those who try to ridicule him on the grounds that if there exists only one thing, then the argument leads to many absurd and contradictory conclusions. My book attacks those who say that several things exist, aiming to show that their hypothesis, that several things exist, leads to even more ridiculous results, if you examine it properly, than the hypothesis that only one thing exists. It was with that sort of ambition that I wrote it when I was young. And after it was written, someone stole it. We have a cliffhanger to end on. But the really intriguing thing that Zeno says here is that the view that many things exist leads to even more ridiculous consequences than the view that only one thing exists. So it follows that Zeno is admitting that it is ridiculous to say that only one thing exists, that Parmenides' theory is ridiculous. It leads to really an absurd view of the world. But the view that more than one thing exists leads to an even more absurd universe. Absurdity every way you look. I mean, I do think we have a 24-year-old enjoying being a little bit mischievous here. Now, we're going to have to think yet again, what is Zeno really up to? Why is he writing these paradoxes? Does he really think that we can't move? I'm going to be suggesting, after we've looked at the paradoxes, that up to a point they can be solved, but only up to a point, because as I'm going to say at the end, I think Zeno does leave us with some very profound questions to ask about motion, and particularly, of course, about the nature of space and time on which motion depends. And I don't think we've yet answered all Zeno's challenges.